Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video, and today I thought it'd be fun to make a Pixar movie bracket challenge. Obviously, March Madness has started and people are filling out their brackets, and I thought it'd be fun to do one with Pixar movies. Now, before we start, the bracket that I used doesn't include Inside Out 2 or Elemental. I'm a fan of both, but obviously they aren't the greatest Pixar films of all time, so I think it's fine if they've been excluded from the bracket. Without further ado, let's get into it. So for the first matchup, it is Monsters, Inc. versus The Incredibles. These are two Pixar classics. I grew up loving both films, but personally, I hold Monsters, Inc. closer to my heart than I do The Incredibles. So for that reason, I think Monsters, Inc. is going to win this matchup. I have nothing against The Incredibles, but I think Monsters, Inc. is a more recognizable Pixar franchise, and I grew up liking Monsters, Inc. more than The Incredibles. Now, let's move on to the next matchup. Here we have WALL-E versus Soul. For me, WALL-E is one of Pixar's greatest films. WALL-E was one of my favorite movies growing up. And looking back on it, they kind of predicted how the world could be in the future. They depicted people just mindlessly scrolling and having robots do everything for them, which could potentially be a future for us. On the other hand, we have Soul, which is one of Pixar's newer films. This one had a deeper meaning for the older audience. It was for sure different than a lot of other Pixar films we're familiar with. Soul is a great movie, I give it that, but WALL-E is hands down better. Now for the WALL-E and Monsters, Inc. matchup, I think Monsters, Inc. takes the cake on this. Both are great movies, but I think it just comes down to which movie I'd rather watch, and that would be Monsters, Inc. So out of this region, Monsters, Inc. moves on to the Elite 8. For the next matchup, we have Finding Nemo versus Toy Story 2. Finding Nemo is another Pixar classic that I grew up watching. I love this movie. It was so relaxing, it was emotional, and I always had a fun time watching it. And Toy Story 2 is one of Pixar's better sequels. I really like this movie, and I like the addition of the new characters, but I think Nemo wins this matchup. Next up, it is Brave versus Monsters University. Growing up, I used to hate Brave as a movie. I don't know if it was the animation style or something like that, but I was never interested in watching it. I've come around to realize that Brave is actually a really good movie, and I think it's an underrated Pixar movie. Now, Monsters University, the prequel to Monsters, Inc., is absolute cinema. This honestly might be better than the first movie. We see how Mike and Sully meet, and they make a lot of jokes about the college lifestyle here in America. All around great movie. So for that reason, Monsters University wins this matchup. Now for Monsters University versus Finding Nemo, I gotta go with the classic Finding Nemo. Don't get me wrong, Monsters University is great, but I have a deeper connection to Nemo. So for that reason, Finding Nemo moves on to the Elite 8. For our next matchup, we have Lightyear versus Onward. Two of Pixar's more recent films. I'm not gonna lie, both of these movies are pretty mid. The Lightyear trailer was super promising, and then the movie came out, and it was extremely disappointing. I'm not going to get into it, but Lightyear is probably Pixar's worst film. Now for Onward, I didn't mind the meaning of it or the story, but it too was kind of boring. I really don't have much to say, and I'm just going to put Onward through because I like it more than Lightyear. Let's move on to the next matchup. Next, we have Inside Out versus Ratatouille. Once again, two of Pixar's greats. Starting off with Inside Out, I'm pretty sure this is one of Pixar's biggest films. For me, I think it's an instant classic, and I really like the emotions, and I never really get tired of watching this movie. Now for Ratatouille, I think this was an underrated film for a very long time, and then recently people started showing a lot of love for it. But for some reason, I didn't really like the movie growing up, and I don't really have any fond memories of it. I don't know if it was the style of the characters or that a rodent was cooking up some meals in a kitchen. So with that being said, this might be an upset, but Inside Out wins this matchup. Now for Inside Out versus Onward, obviously Inside Out wins this matchup. The next matchup is Bug's Life versus The Good Dinosaur. A Bug's Life was one of Pixar's first films, and I think it still holds up to this day. I personally think it's a really good film, and a lot of people have this as their favorite. The Good Dinosaur was really controversial when it came out because a lot of people liked it and a lot of people hated it. I like this movie. It had a lot of good messages, and the graphics are insane. But personally, I'm choosing the classic A Bug's Life. For the next matchup, we have Toy Story versus Finding Dory. Toy Story is Pixar's first ever film, and it is an absolute classic. This movie made history as it was the first fully computer-generated movie ever produced. This is definitely one of my favorite Pixar films. Now, Finding Dory, on the other hand, is a sequel to Finding Nemo, obviously. Personally, I find Dory to be an extremely annoying character, and this movie kind of follows the same steps as Finding Nemo did, so it's basically the same story. I wasn't really a huge fan of it when it came out. All of you saw this coming. Toy Story wins this matchup. Now, to move on to the Elite 8, it is A Bug's Life versus Toy Story, and I think Toy Story wins this matchup. Now, moving on to the other side of the bracket, we have Cars versus Cars 3 for the first matchup. When I was little, I couldn't stop watching Cars. Lightning McQueen was my favorite character, and I was addicted to this movie. I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen this movie, but it still never gets old. Now, Cars 3, on the other hand, ruined Lightning McQueen. Yeah, I know, they were trying to give him a proper send-off and replace him with Cruz Ramirez, but I still didn't like the direction they took with it. Cars is obviously the superior movie here. Next up is Turning Red versus Luca. Turning Red is honestly one of the cringiest Pixar movies I've ever seen. I can't really relate to anything in this movie because I'm not the target demographic, and I found it to just be kind of weird and annoying. But Luca is a great movie. The visuals, the storyline, and the plot twist at the end, honestly a chef's kiss of a movie. I don't really have anything else to say about this matchup, and obviously Luca wins it. Now for Cars versus Luca, I'm putting Cars through no matter what. Yes, I'm a little biased because Cars is my favorite Pixar film, but I do think Cars is a better movie than Luca. So Cars has moved on to the Elite 8. Our next matchup is Cars 2 versus Coco. A lot of people don't like Cars 2. They think it strays away from the original film where it was focused on racing, and then the second film it turns into a spy blockbuster. But I like the spy vibes, and I think the World Grand Prix is so cool. Again, I'm a little biased because I love the Cars franchise. Now, if we turn our attention to Coco, I think it's a great film as well. It really pulls on your heartstrings, and the visuals and the songs are really good as well. This is going to be another upset, but Cars 2 wins over Coco. Don't get me wrong, I like Coco, but I like Cars 2 more. Our next matchup is The Incredibles 2 versus Toy Story 3. I remember the hype for Incredibles 2 when it was coming out. There was like a 15-year span between the first movie and the second movie releasing, so people were excited. I know some people don't really like this film, but I personally liked it a lot. The action sequences and the visuals and the animation were top tier. Now, Toy Story 3, which in my opinion should have been the end of the Toy Story franchise, was a great send-off for all the characters. We saw Andy leave for college and the toys enter a daycare. This movie played with my emotions because it was funny, it was sad, and you can't forget about the scary monkey. This thing left me traumatized for years. I'm still scared of this thing, to be honest. Anyways, I do think Toy Story 3 is the better film of the two. To move on to the Elite 8, it is Cars 2 versus Toy Story 3, and I give this one to Toy Story 3. For the final matchup before moving on to the Elite 8, it is Up versus Toy Story 4. Up is another Pixar classic, and I loved watching this movie growing up. And I think it's still good to watch to this day. It's sad, it's funny, it plays with your emotions, but I love the story and the meaning. Now for Toy Story 4, you guys kind of know how I feel about it because I said Toy Story 3 should have been the end of the franchise. I truly think it was an unnecessary film, and it wasn't that good. So for that, Up wins this matchup. I should also mention that Up automatically moves on to the Elite 8 and the Final 4 because it has no other movies to go up against. For our first matchup in the Elite 8, it is Monsters, Inc. versus Finding Nemo. Both are top-tier Pixar films, and I have to go with what my heart says, and it tells me to choose Finding Nemo. This was one of my childhood favorites, and I love this film. So that's why Nemo is moving on to the Final 4. Next up, it is Inside Out versus Toy Story. Inside Out is top-tier Pixar quality, but I have to give it to the OG classic Toy Story. On the other side of the bracket, the matchup is Cars versus Toy Story 3. Toy Story 3 is a great movie, but nothing can beat out the superior Cars. You all saw it coming. Cars moves on. Like I mentioned earlier, Up automatically moves on because it had no other matchups to face. The first Final Four matchup is Finding Nemo versus Toy Story. This may be an upset to a lot of you, but I'm choosing Nemo over Toy Story. On the other side of the bracket, it is Cars versus Up. I'm a Cars fanboy, so I'm putting Cars all the way through to the finals. I also think it's a better film than Up. So we have our final set. It is Cars versus Finding Nemo. Two of my childhood favorites and all-time classics. I do think Cars is the better movie, and it's my all-time favorite, so I think Cars is the best Pixar movie of all time. Thanks for sticking around if you watched this entire video. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite Pixar film is. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. Peace out.